we don't want to be underpinning our defence on the hope that a country that is reacting very differently to how it did before. I mean, the world's policemen really respected the international institutions that underpinned international rule of law and all that sort of stuff. If they're starting to become more selfish and they don't really care about those sorts of things, we need to make sure that we understand where they are and where their key support to us, where the lines are drawn. And it might be that it is still on the Article 5 line and on the Article 5 agreement, and I hope so. And in that case, then our investment needs to be steered in a very particular direction.
Keir Starmer then off to Paris to talk to European leaders about the future of Ukraine. They've had to hastily arrange a meeting after Donald Trump's phone call with Vladimir Putin last week. Perhaps as a way of encouraging the other Europeans, the Prime Minister says that Britain is ready to send peacekeeping troops to Ukraine. We'll look at what role British troops could play in a moment. But before that, Starmer's cabinet colleague Wes Streeting told us an hour ago this was more than just a problem for Ukraine.
It is an existential question for Europe as a whole. That's why the gathering today is important. Next week, he'll be travelling to Washington to meet with President Trump, no doubt relaying the outcome of some of those discussions today. Britain is prepared to do whatever it takes to guarantee our collective security and to make sure that not only do we bring an end to the war in Ukraine, but we bring about a lasting peace as well that guarantees Ukrainian freedom, security and democracy, and British freedom, security and democracy too.
If whatever it takes is tens of thousands of troops to police that border as part of a peacekeeping deal, would we be prepared to do a recruitment drive for the armed forces?
Well, look, I think it's premature to be talking about numbers and.
Well, it isn't, though, is it? Because with respect, if the Prime Minister is going today to a meeting of European leaders to ask them to do the same, you do need to be talking about numbers because it's very clear that this is happening quite quickly now. So, do we have an idea of the scale of troops that we would be able to send? Do we know?
Look, the Prime Minister set out his argument today, and no doubt will be saying more during the course of today. I'm not going to get into a game of speculating about numbers.
That's an untypically circumspect Wes Streeting there. Let's get the thoughts of General Sir Nick Parker, former commander of land forces in the British Army. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
You heard Wes Streeting there. Are we doing whatever it takes for collective security at the moment?
I think there are two things that immediately spring to mind for me. The first is that one of the core assumptions that we've made, certainly since 9/11, has been that if we have to do anything at scale in defence, we will be underwritten by the US. And my experience, certainly in Iraq and Afghanistan, was that the UK and the other minor contributors to the coalition were entirely dependent on a US spine and all the US enablers that made the force work. The second point I'd make is that it does seem to be a little bit early to start talking about sending troops to Ukraine when there's a hot war going on, a brutal hot war going on. And I'm very nervous of the term peacekeeping. If you're going to deploy something into an environment where you're expected to keep the peace, you have to fight, and that requires all the military capabilities. So I think it's very premature to start talking about the UK, certainly not on its own, going and doing something which requires us to be able to fight really hard at a time when our armed forces are pretty tight.
And can you envisage fighting Russia really hard? Because once you have British troops, even in a peacekeeping role, fighting for Ukraine, they're fighting against Russia then, and we've got all sorts of NATO complications, you would imagine.
I mean, don't misinterpret me, because my point is that if you're going to keep the peace, you have to be able to be credible in fighting. If you're not credible, if you don't have a credible force, then the people that you're trying to keep at bay will take advantage of it. So you want to deter by being credible and capable and stopping your potential aggressor from attacking you. Now, I think it is dangerous to start talking about defence requirements around the basis of a peacekeeping force in a country which is still fighting and where the terms of any agreement are way away.
And also, we're not really party to them because the terms of the peace are being negotiated away from the Europeans.
Yes, and I mean, that speaks for itself. It suggests that there's something going on. The world's policemen who we have come to rely on over the last couple of decades, is now acting very much unilaterally. And that's extremely worrying if you've come to rely on US capability to underpin your defense.
Can we cope without US support?
Well, I think one has to. I think, again, we don't want to move too quickly, but it does seem to me that the very first thing that one should do is to view your own resilience at home. Are we a resilient country? Do we have air defense? Do we have sea defense for the country to be secure? Have we got an industrial strategy, a food strategy, an energy strategy, which allows us to be secure at home? And once you've done that, you then start to look at what you need to do in order to be able to keep any wider threats at bay. And that seems to me to be absolutely essentially part of an alliance or a coalition of like-minded countries. And your question suggests that we need to be much more circumspect about the US being part of that, certainly in its initial stages.
We talk a lot about GDP on defence spending, and in some ways it doesn't help people envisage it in their minds. Actually, they're very sort of oblique numbers. 2.5% of a variable number doesn't really mean anything to many people. But you know exactly what it means in practice, Nick. Is the thing that we have to do, particularly if the US starts to withdraw itself, can we do that on the current budget? If we can't do it on the current budget, what sort of a budget would it take to do it?
Take a hell of a lot of money. I mean, I think we're getting rather hung on the figures. To me, the key thing is, have we got the capacity to both identify what we need, to then transform our organizations so they can adapt to the new order? And then thirdly, can our systems generate the capability that we want in the time available? I mean, we certainly can't do anything in 3 weeks. You're not going to be spending 3.5% of GDP in the next 6 months. This is going to take time, and it must be underpinned by a big idea. We've got to be led in this by identifying what it is that we're required to do, and then how do we resource that idea, and how does our military establishment transform itself? We don't want to invest in what we were doing before. We must invest in what we need to do in the future, and that will require major transformation, not least in our ability to procure things.
So what is the big idea? Is the big idea, and then what follows from that is, I guess, how much money should we spend on that big idea? What is the big idea? Is the big idea we need to be resilient, we need to be able to sustain our own borders, but also we need to be part of a big European exercise to withstand against Russia? Is that the big idea? The big idea is that we have to imagine NATO without the US.
I think you have to imagine the Europeans doing more in order to deter Russia. What I would hope happens as a result of all these discussions is that we get some sort of an assurance from the Americans that if we are prepared to step up to the plate, we still have American enablers, American guarantees, certainly, and I forgive the language, but on the line of the Article 5 treaty, the NATO treaty, the Article 5 line, so that if somebody was to, they're signed up members of the NATO alliance. At the moment, if one country is attacked, everybody else responds. We need to work out whether that is still extant in the Americans' minds.
Do you think that's a question? Do you think that's a legitimate question, Nick? I mean, that to me is a real article of faith that's been there for since the alliance was formed. Do you think we have to at least question that now?
I think we have to make sure that we demonstrate that we're doing enough on our side of the bargain to ensure that the Americans understand that they still have that commitment. But yeah, I absolutely think we need to ask it, because some of the things that are going on at the moment are pretty bizarre, and we don't want to be underpinning our defense on the hope that a country that is reacting very differently to how it did before. I mean, the world's policemen really respected the international institutions that underpinned international rule of law and all that sort of stuff. If they're starting to become more selfish and they don't really care about those sorts of things, we need to make sure that we understand where they are and where their key support to us, where the lines are drawn. And it might be that it is still on the Article 5 line and on the Article 5 agreement, and I hope so. And in that case, then our investment needs to be steered in a very particular direction.
Again, the question is also, do we trust them? And we've had decades of trusting them, and Trump is a very individual person. He represents himself as much as he represents the state. And the question of, can you trust an America led by Trump in that way?
And I can't answer that question. I think it's a very good question, and what you deduce from that is that we need to work very closely to try and make sure we understand him and that he understands what we bring to his party, because I think he's probably triggered by understanding what benefits him. And at the same time, we need to take steps, contingency steps, to make sure that we're secure. And I think your point, it's a resilience and then the ability to contribute with our neighbours to keep ourselves secure from any external threat. And the most likely threat would come from Russia, particularly if some weird deal in Ukraine ends up leaving everybody more vulnerable than they were before Putin effectively walked straight into a sovereign neighbour. I mean, he can't be allowed to get away with that without leaving some real uncertainty in the world about what's going to happen next.
And that must be a concern for everybody. Sir Nick Parker, good to speak to you. Thank you for joining us.